Okay, we're gonna get started. Good morning and welcome everyone. We're so glad that you could join us today. We're hopeful that you agree that this is a great way to start off your morning. My name is Elizabeth Kronk Warner, and I have what I believe is the best job in the world because I have the pleasure of being the Dean at the S.J. Quinney College of Law. And I'm really excited that you can join us for this June edition of the Dean's Book Review. And because June is Pride Month, we are here to celebrate Pride Month and to discuss issues related to the LGBTQ plus community and to celebrate the contributions of that community, not only to the S.J. Quinney College of Law, but also to Utah and to the nation in general. So in recognition of Pride Month, we have selected this book, which is This Is How It Always Is, as our book to read for June. The book is really a heartwarming and lovely story about a family. It starts with an initial romance between the mother and the father, and then it moves really to focus on the story of their growing family and the challenges that they face as a family. 4 boys are born, and then a 5th boy is born. But at an early age, the 5th boy really realizes that she wants to be a girl and not a boy. And then the book tells the story of the lengths the family goes to in order to protect her secret and the ramifications of keeping secrets. And I think one of our panelists is going to talk a little bit about that theme later on. It's really a heartwarming look into one family's attempt to find a middle way or a middle path when the path is just not that clear. So if you haven't had a chance to read the book, we really encourage you to do so because, again, I think you'll find that it's a heartwarming and lovely story of one family going through these challenges. So for today's structure, I'm going to start off with just some initial thoughts that I had reading the book. And then I'm going to turn it over to one of our amazing alumna, Jane Marquardt, who's Vice Chair of Management and Training Corporation. She's going to speak for about 10 to 15 minutes. And then she'll turn it over to Professor Terry Kogan, who's a professor here at the S.J. Quinney College of Law, who will also speak for about 10 to 15 minutes. We're really excited to have both of them on the panel here today, as they have been very involved in the LGBTQ plus community here in the Salt Lake area for years, and I'm excited to hear what they have to say about the book. That will hopefully, after we're done with their presentations, leave us with about 15 to 20 minutes for questions. If you go to the bottom of your screen, you'll see a button that says Q&A. Please type your questions into the Q&A box and I will moderate the questions when it comes time for the questions. Unfortunately, you probably saw that Professor Cliff Roski was supposed to be with us this morning. He ruptured a disc in his neck and is unfortunately in quite a bit of pain, and so he's not able to join us today. We will certainly miss Professor Roski, but we really wish him a speedy recovery. So with that, I want to jump into some of my thoughts that were triggered as I was reading the books. And to be honest, there are many thoughts that were triggered while reading the book, but because of our limited time, I'm just going to focus on 2 issues that related to my own time as a practicing attorney. So first, there's a scene in the book early on in the daughter's lifetime. I believe she's in kindergarten. When the parents go to meet with the principal and the daughter, Poppy's teacher, and then the teacher's representative to talk about how the issue that Poppy was gender dysphoric or trans was going to be discussed in Poppy's classroom, and to discuss through issues such as bathroom accommodations and other issues that could come up as a result of the fact that Poppy was trans. And as I was reading this scene with the parents and again the teacher and the principal and the teacher's aide, I was reminded of my work that I did as a young attorney. My pro bono work was all associated with individual education plans or IEPs and working with school districts and helping school districts and families find appropriate IEPs that served the students. So an IEP, or an individualized education plan, is based on the Individuals with Disabilities Act. And the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act requires public schools to provide special education and related services to eligible students. But not every child who struggles in school qualifies. Specifically, to qualify for an IEP under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, you have to be adversely affected by a disability in one of 13 categories. And the 13 categories are a specific learning disability, such as dyslexia, or a health impairment, autism, emotional disturbance, speech or language impairment, visual impairment, which includes blindness, deafness, hearing impairment, deaf and blindness, orthopedic impairment, intellectual disability, traumatic brain injury, or if you have multiple disabilities, then an IEP is appropriate for you. Now, as you probably noticed, as I read through that list of 13 disabilities that are covered by the IDEA, gender dysphoria was not covered under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And so as a result, nationwide, school districts are not required to provide IEPs for students with gender dysphoria under federal law. So as a result, the experience that parents will have and students will have will very much vary based on the district that the student finds themselves in. And so that's why in the book we saw in Wisconsin, I think where the family initially was when Poppy decides that she is a girl and wants to present as a girl, the school district tried to be accommodating, but by requiring her to do things like go to the bathroom in the nurse's station and requiring her to kind of be outed to her classmates, it created some trouble for her and some challenges, versus the family eventually decides that Wisconsin's not safe for them, and so they move to Seattle. And there in Seattle, they decide, along with consulting the principal, that the teacher doesn't need to know, and they decide not to out Poppy to her classmates. And the principal says that it's fine for her to use the girls' bathroom. And so we do see some difference in how the schools approach the fact that Poppy has gender dysphoria between the Wisconsin school district and the Seattle school district. And that's why, because gender dysphoria does not fall under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. So I couldn't help but wonder, so that's the current status of the law. It's very much district by district. But I do have to wonder whether the Supreme Court's decision this past week in Bostock versus Clayton County is going to have any impact on this development, and specifically the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. Now, the recent decision of the Supreme Court, which hopefully you heard about, was a situation where there were several combined cases, and in each of the cases, an employer allegedly fired a longtime employee simply for being homosexual or transgendered. For example, in the Clayton County, Georgia case, they fired Gerald Bostock for conduct unbecoming of a county employee shortly after he began participating in gay recreational softball league. And ultimately, the court held that this type of discrimination violated Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And so therefore, it gave protections to workers who fall into an LGBTQ status. And obviously, this was a groundbreaking decision from the Supreme Court from the past year. Now, clearly, because IEPs are based on the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and the decision in Bostock is based on Title VII, there's not necessarily going to be an immediate impact to whether or not children with gender dysphoria will have or will be entitled to an IEP moving forward. But I do have to wonder that the language, which is very supportive of protections for LGBTQ people, won't eventually be used in a way to support IEPs for children with gender dysphoria. So definitely something to pay attention to, and definitely something that I was thinking about when I was reading the book. The other thing that was really triggering for me when I read the book is there's a scene in the book where the mom is a doctor, And initially, when they lived in Wisconsin, she was an emergency room doctor. And there's a scene where a woman comes into the ER who's been heavily abused and beat up and even has a gunshot wound in her shoulder. And as they remove her clothing to treat her, they find out that she is a trans woman. And this reminded me of my experiences as a domestic violence advocate. And what I found as a domestic violence advocate, that when we talk about domestic violence and sexual assault, it's a very heteronormative white conversation, because nationally the statistics we talk about and a lot of the solutions we talk about focus on heterosexuals and focus on the dominant white society. And so as I was reading this heartbreaking story, and unfortunately the woman ultimately dies, and it's tremendously traumatic on the mom, and I think that's the catalyst for why they leave Wisconsin and move to Seattle. But I was just thinking about this experience, about how that's consistent with my own experience as a domestic violence advocate, that unfortunately members of the LGBTQ plus are particularly vulnerable to sexual assault and to domestic violence. And so I did a little research into this and found that the Human Rights Campaign has done extensive research into the statistics of domestic violence and sexual assault for the LGBTQ plus community. And they found that 44% of lesbians and 61% of bisexual women experience rape, physical violence, or stalking by an intimate partner, compared to 35% of straight women. 26% of gay men and 37% of bisexual men experience rape, physical violence, or stalking by an intimate partner, compared to 29% of straight men. 46% of bisexual women have been raped, compared to 17% of straight women and 13% of lesbians. 22% of bisexual women have been raped by an intimate partner, compared to 9% of straight women. 40% of gay men and 47% of bisexual men have experienced sexual violence other than rape, compared to 21% of straight men. Within the LGBTQ plus community, transgendered people and bisexual women face the most alarming rates of sexual violence. Among both of these populations, sexual violence begins early, often in childhood. There was a 2015 US transgender survey that found that 47% of transgender people are sexually assaulted at some point in their lifetime. Among people of color, American Indian individuals, this is 65%. For multiracial people, this is 59%. For Middle Eastern people, 58%, and for Black people, 53% were likely to have sexually assaulted in their lifetime. If you think about that, that is over 50% for all these categories and upwards of 2/3 of some of these categories, which is shocking and completely unacceptable. Nearly half, 48% of bisexual women who are rape survivors experience their first rape between the ages of 11 and 17. For LGBTQ plus survivors of sexual assault, their identities and the discrimination they face surrounding those identities often make them hesitant to seek help from police, hospitals, shelters, or rape crisis centers, which are the very resources that are supposed to help them, and this makes them uniquely vulnerable. 85% of victim advocates surveyed reported having worked with an LGBTQ plus survivor who was denied services because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. That 2015 US Transgendered survey found that 1 in 5, or 20% of respondents, were incarcerated in jail, prison, or juvenile detention in the past year were sexually assaulted while in that facility. Additionally, 17% of respondents who stayed at one or more homeless shelters in the past year were again sexually assaulted while taking advantage of that facility. So bringing it back to the law, there is the Violence Against Women Act. So the Violence Against Women Act remains the only piece of federal legislation that includes explicit civil rights protections for LGBTQ communities. VAWA focuses on preventing and responding to domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, and stalking. These protections have altered the landscape for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgendered, and queer survivors, particularly those who have experienced marginalizations based on more than one identity. And so the VAWA Act is incredibly important. And these high rates of violence against members of the LGBTQ community are often caused and exacerbated by a lack of LGBTQ plus affirming prevention and support. So therefore, VAWA plays a very important role. Now, what you might have heard is that the funding for VAWA, for the Violence Against Women Act, sunsetted in 2019. So while VAWA is still on the books, many argue that is not adequately supported and funded. And so this has led to concerns about the LGBTQ community not having the resources that it needs under the Violence Against Women Act. So we as lawyers, I think, have an opportunity here to take a hard look at the Violence Against Women Act and to see what we can do collectively as lawyers. So that's my time. I very much enjoyed the book. There's much more we could talk about, but I'm going to turn it over to our amazing SJQ alumna, Jane Marquardt. Jane, take it away.
Thank you, Dean. I want to start by just thanking you and other members of the law school staff for starting this book club. I love to read. It's fun to, I've been able to participate in most of the book reviews so far. So it's fun to read a book and then hear your impressions, and I appreciate the panelists that you get. Plus I love the free CLE, so thank you, and I hope the law school keeps this up. In my over 40 years since I graduated from the law school, this is the first time I can think of this sort of opportunity, so it's great. You know, I thought that this was really a charming book, and even though in some ways the story is not totally realistic, it is a story of a family with a trans child. And I mean, really, how many stories do we have an opportunity to read about that? I don't think there are that many novels yet published about it. So a couple observations just on this story. And then let me talk about what I think is the most important lesson that I got out of the book, which was the power of secrets and the power of dispelling secrets. But just, you know, what's not to love about the family in this book? What LGBT child gets to be born into a family who is this supportive? You know, I suppose there are a few, but most of us, even if our parents were wanting to be supportive of us, they're like horrified, like, what, you're different? How, what? And this family just goes out of their way to try to learn about it and deal with it. And even though as the novel progresses, each of the, there's four older siblings, all boys, to this, the trans child who's the youngest. They all in one way or another out the family secret, and then they feel bad about it. There's still, it's just a really lovable family. And one of the, just the side notes, a couple side notes I liked about the family is the way the parents would have all this stress in their lives and managing 5 kids, not necessarily to do with the fact that they're dealing with the issues of their youngest, but they would rank their problems and go, oh my God, this has been a horrible day, and I've got 30 things, but this is only number 11, so put it to the side, I'm not going to worry about it. And that's really, don't we all do that? You know, you have a bad day and you go, your family member says to pay attention to this, and you say, I can't pay attention to that. That's number 9 on my list of crises right now. There was another scene where the family is debating over hanging the family photos when they moved to Seattle, and they put up all the family photos, and then they go, this is going to be confusing for our new neighbors who come through, because these early pictures of our youngest child as a boy, Claude, and then he becomes a girl, Poppy, and we're going to have to tell the story when somebody walks by. And so they just end up taking most of the photos down. And how many of us, that's not just unique to LGBT people, it's unique to any sort of blended family. As you age, you have different vacations and different weddings and different experiences, and then somebody gets divorced, and then you go, oh my gosh, I got to change that hallway of the family pictures. We got to either, maybe we can leave it up, or maybe we need to take them out because that's going to insult the next spouse. But it's just this sort of very real human thing of, well, what family photos do I hang up in this day and age? One of the other unrealistic but fun things is that the parents in this book, Penn and Rosie, find this counselor who is a specialist in the issues they're facing with their younger child. His name is Mr. Tongo. and he is just ecstatic over the fact that he says they're when they say, well, we're coming in with this issue of gender dysphoria, and he's like, oh my gosh, you are so lucky, we are so lucky. And every time they talk to him through the book, he is just thrilled that they get to be working on this issue. And it's like, how many people get to find a counselor like that? Probably not too many, but those are some great little human things I liked about the book. But I thought the major part of the book was coming at the issue of keeping a secret and what that means from a lot of different angles. And so it starts when Claude, as a little child who is still presenting as a boy, but is feeling inside that, he's wearing girls' dresses in the morning, and then after breakfast, he goes and puts on his boy clothes to go to kindergarten. And the teachers and then the parents notice that as he draws pictures of himself and his family, he just continues to disappear, and he gets smaller and smaller until he's not even in the pictures. And that's a wake-up call for the family to say, what's wrong here? And they discover, well, when I have to show up as my little boy Claude self, I don't feel worthy. I'm not happy. And so they work with the school, and he starts dressing as his girl identity, Poppy, that's where he can express himself, and he comes back into the pictures. And I thought that was really interesting. But when any of us are having to live a role that we don't feel is right, it does make us feel like we're disappearing. I think back to my own days in the early 80s as a young lawyer, and I was starting to do seminars for mostly lesbian couples, and they weren't advertised. We had them in coffee shops in Salt Lake where we closed the blinds, and it was word of mouth only. And I was teaching them the radical idea of how to write powers of attorney for themselves that we didn't even know would be honored if they did have a medical emergency. But writing powers of attorney for your partner for medical and financial decisions and writing wills was all we could do. That was it. And so that was the legal tool I had to teach. But I had to sneak around to do it. And that made me feel somewhat diminished in my role as an attorney, because here I'm putting a lot of effort into teaching something, but I can't put that on my resume. I can't say, well, this is something that I'm doing. And as I worked through that, it really, I myself grew into that power that we discover when we stop keeping the secrets. And so when we become our true selves, we grow into that power of authenticity. I remember, now go forward a decade in my legal career, and in the early 90s, I had started to do some public speaking events where I identified myself as a lesbian, and I was worried I would lose my clients. In fact, I had one fellow who didn't like me because I had represented his son in a trial, and we lost, mostly because my client was lying throughout the whole thing. I did but the best I could with that kid's lies, but anyway, we deservedly lost. And his father filed a bar complaint against me and said, well, she's obviously a horrible attorney. She's talking in the paper about being gay, and we all know that gay people can't be trusted. And so it was a wake-up call to me. I think, oh my gosh, is this guy going to be, is that representative of all my clients? I've been practicing now getting close to 15 years. And I've got a good practice, and I was in Ogden. Am I going to lose it because people know who I am? But really what happened is it showed me again personally that power of authenticity, because let's see, about in 1990, I took a year off and went back to school and got a master's in tax law in San Diego, and then came back and really started specializing in estate planning and tax transaction things. But that was also a time I was starting to make public speeches about being gay. And I thought, well, now I've got this fancy tax degree and I'm going to do fancy stuff for people, but who's going to come? And I found that I ended up with just a lot of LDS clients who were anxious for me to do their work. And I think probably because they thought, I can go to Jane and she is who she says she is. And also they could probably think that I wasn't part of that church and I wouldn't be telling anybody how much money they really had. So I was a safe place to be. But that power of telling your story is really summarized towards the end of the book. And I was just going to read a couple paragraphs here. if you have the hardback cover of the book, I'm looking at the bottom of page 311. And this is a conversation between the two magical characters that the dad makes up and become more and more prominent through the book, the Prince Grumwald and Princess Stephanie, which turns out to be a conversation about the two beings within the youngest child, but also kind of within us all anyway. The conversation between Grumwald and Stephanie, it says, you know, you have to tell, you can't be a secret. Secret leads to panic. When you keep it a secret, you get hysterical. When you tell, you get magic. And Princess Stephanie says, what do you mean magic? You find out you're not alone. And so does everyone else. And that's how everything gets better. You share your secret. You share your secret and you change the world. So if you tell your story, that's where the magic comes. And story is the best magic there is. And that really resonated with me, both in reading this book and just in my own experience. Every time I've grown to another level of being authentic, I get more powerful as a person and I get better at what I do. I'm freer to be creative and I'm freer to listen to other people because I'm not trying to filter out what I say about myself. So I loved that part about the book. And then just the last point I want to make is I thought it's a little artificial in the last part of the book when all of a sudden they jump to Thailand, and I wasn't quite sure how that fit. But it drives home the importance of having a role model, because the reason they go to Thailand is the mother, who's a doctor, goes there to, I think, work for 3 months in a clinic. And she's out in the countryside and deals with all sorts of horrific medical problems without medical supplies, but is assisted by a character named Kay. And Kay is a trans person who is not shy about that, doesn't apologize for it, just is digging in and doing the work of the clinic. And so Kay becomes really an important role model for the mom and also for the child. And it shows the people, the power in finding people like yourself in life and also in stories. I remember when I was barely realized that I was a lesbian, and so now I'm talking late 70s, being able to find a book that had a lesbian or gay character in it was magic. I used to, if I went to a friend's house and saw a Rita Mae Brown book on their bookshelf, oh my God, they might be gay too, because that's what we all do, is read Rita Mae Brown books. And I would occasionally go to San Francisco and just spend hours in the bookstore there. It was either called City Lights or a different light, or maybe both. But it was so empowering to read other stories about people like you, and they don't have to be exactly like you, but anything like you. It gives you courage to come and be yourself. So I will stop there and turn the time over to Professor Terry Kogan, who is one of those people in my life who gave me the courage to grow into myself. I met Terry in the mid-'80s when he came to the law school to begin his teaching career. And over the years, we have worked on many presentations together. We have been on boards together. One of my funnest memories of doing something with Professor Kogan is in the mid-'90s, the Utah Supreme Court decided they wanted to be educated about LGBT issues. So they were meeting down in Moab, and they invited Terry and myself to come and educate them about gay issues. And of course, they didn't invite just us. They invited 2 professors from BYU Law School also. So Terry and I went down there to face off against the BYU professors, and it was a lot of fun. And we obviously won the day, because now the laws have changed much more towards the arguments we were making. But I will stop there, and Terry, take it away.
Thanks, Jane. So I think Jane and I truly have a mutual admiration society. Jane is someone who I met early when I first arrived in Utah, and quickly gained an extraordinary respect for her, I guess, first off as an attorney, but most importantly, as a a woman, ultimately a gay person, who had the fortitude to stand up for women's issues, gay issues, and has had a major impact on the Utah community. I also want to thank Dean Kronk Warner for providing the opportunity to read books and talk about them, books that are worth the attention of all of us. So now on to the book. I believe that underlying this gentle novel is a revolutionary theory of human gender identity, one that is now referred to by many people as non-binary identity. And to introduce this idea, I want to read two very short dialogues from part 4 of the book. The first comes from the fantasy tale that Jane mentioned, that was introduced in the father's bedtime stories to his kids, a tale involving characters named Prince Grumwald and his alternative identity, Princess Stephanie. Well, Grumwald, by the end of the book, is struggling with this split identity, and he comes to talk to a witch to see if she can help him out. And here's this short dialogue. The witch says, "So, do we lose Grumwald or Princess Stephanie? I forgot who you were to begin with." And then Grumwald responds, "I want both Grumwald and Princess Stephanie." And the witch says, "I'll just leave the spell and you can keep going back and forth." And Grumwald finally says, "Not each, both. I want to be both." The second dialogue is near the very end of the book and is a dialogue between the principal character, Poppy, and her friend Aggie at a dance that takes place in the school gym. Poppy's parents are chaperoning, and she has no desire to watch her parents dance together. So she goes into the girls' bathroom, and lo and behold, she encounters Aggie, and they had had a falling out earlier in the book. And Aggie says, "We can't be friends anymore." And Poppy says, "Why not?" And Aggie says, "Because I don't know you anymore. Poppy, if I ask you a question, will you tell me the truth?" And Poppy says, "Yes." And Aggie says, "Are you a boy or are you a girl?" And Poppy's response is, "No, I am not." And Aggie says, "Well, what are you then?" And Poppy says, "I don't know, something else instead." And Aggie very reasonably says, "What else is there?" And Poppy says, "I'm all of the above, and I'm also more to come." It seems to me that these dialogues introduce the idea of a non-binary identity. We're all familiar with the notion of binary identity. There's a long-standing assumption that everyone is either male or female. Men have one set of genitals, women the opposite. Men are attracted to women, women are attracted to men. Men tend to be more aggressive and women are gentler, etc., etc. But we now understand that what it means to be a male or a female goes far beyond a person's biology and stereotypes about how they're supposed to act. That being a male or a female also involves the way a person experiences themselves and the way that they express their identity to the world. In the last decades, our society has gained awareness First of transsexual identity, which has now morphed into transgender identity. The idea of a transsexual person was a person who, as the stereotype went, was born into the wrong body. They were born with one set of genitals, but their identity was involved the opposite sex, and accordingly, transsexuals would seek to undergo surgery to change their bodies to match their sex. Over the years, the notion of transsexual changed into a broader umbrella notion of transgender identity. The idea that one did not necessarily have to undergo surgery in order to sense the opposite identity of the biological body that you were born into. So the notion would be that a transgender person is someone born with one set of genitals whose gender identity was the opposite. A woman born with male genitals, but who identified, experienced themselves as a woman. The problem we have come to see with both transsexual and transgender identities are that, in effect, they buy into the binary. They effectively accept the notion that everyone is either male or female. It's now possible that if you can be born with male biology, but be female. But many people are coming to reject this idea. They are coming to reject the idea that their lives fit neatly into one of two boxes, male or female. These people, like Poppy, experience themselves as neither nor, or perhaps both and. These people experience the world as non-binary. Many non-binary people will wear clothes that do not fit the ideal of masculine or feminine. Some may undergo hormone therapy or surgery to change their bodies to fit more closely with how they experience themselves, but many do not. Unfortunately, our very language and our politics make this very difficult. Only recently have we begun using the pronouns they, them, and their as singular to refer to people who reject the two boxes of male and female and, like Poppy, want to live as neither nor or both and. I predict that over the next while, non-binary identity will become more and more common. Many of us will come to see that the two boxes, male and female, and the masculine and feminine ideals that these boxes are cloaked in are way too constricting for our lives. That we have aspects about us that are both male and female and somewhere in between, or as the witch in the dialogue referred to, betwixt. That a vision that rejects that everyone must be male or female. If this interests you, a very recent book was published by Columbia University Press, I'll hold it up, called Non-Binary, Memoirs of Gender and Identity. and I got it through, of course, Amazon. And I recommend it to you. It's a collection of essays that are very, very eye-opening. So I thank you for this time, and I'd like to turn this back over to Dean Kronk Warner for questions for us. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor Kogan. And wow, that was amazing. I love listening to and learning from our two panelists. So now we have time. We have 19 minutes for questions. So again, if you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a button that says Q&A. If you type your questions into that box, I can go ahead and read those questions to our panelists. But while we give time for people to ask their questions, you mentioned, Jane, that you and Professor Kogan have worked on numerous issues over the years, and I think both of you mentioned in your presentations that we've seen changes over the years. I would hope that everybody on this call is familiar with some of the legal changes that have happened nationally, but maybe you could walk us through some of the legal changes affecting the LGBTQ plus community that you've seen in your time working together over the past couple of decades. So how have things changed in Utah or Utah specific laws?
You know, I'll just start with family law. I did, in the 80s, I did a number of family law cases in my practice, and I can recall the first lesbian custody case I had. It wasn't custody, it was visitation. Well, I had a mother who wanted visitation, and the trial was set I think it was set in Moab. And the only case law on the books in Utah was a Supreme Court case that just sort of in dicta referred in a derogatory manner to whether a gay or lesbian parent could even have visitation. So that was the only case law, and just more through power of judges changing and knowing gay people, I think the courts just sort of changed more long before there was any law from the Utah legislature that said you can't take the sexual orientation or gender identity of a parent as a consideration. But the case law developed, and I really think it developed through the power of story, just through more and more people being out and more judges knowing gay families and realizing that wasn't a disqualifier. So that was the first thing that I saw change from a family law perspective. Terry, I don't think there was really a statute that was passed until, hate crimes law was tried in the early 90s, didn't go anywhere. I don't recall what statute was passed before the non-discrimination law of about 3 or 4 years ago. Do you remember any?
There ultimately was, the person who spearheaded hate crime laws in the legislature was David Litvak, who kept coming up with laws that explicitly included making hate crimes against LGBT people a crime, and those laws were regularly those bills were regularly shot down. Ultimately, I believe in the early 2000s, there was a hate crimes law adopted, but there was no mention, very consciously, no mention of LGBT people. And it was milquetoast. It was an empty law that really did nothing, and that, to the best of my knowledge, never was applied. And it has only been in recent years, to a great extent through the work of Equality Utah, which you and I were both on the board of, and through the hard work of my colleague Cliff Roski, that we finally have gained non-discrimination protection in Utah.
Yeah, and I have to give Professor Roski a lot of credit. He has really been a leading light for Equality Utah in massaging and analyzing the legal issues in the last few years, and going back and forth with officials from the LDS Church and members of the legislature, and being very insistent that gender identity also be included. because there was a period of time where I say, all right, we will pass this Utah non-discrimination in employment law, which did pass a few years ago, and a hate crimes law, which passed a couple of years after that, but we're not including gender identity. That is just too weird. And Cliff was insistent, as were some legislators, and Equality Utah, no, you've got to include gender identity. And so it was included, and we really became kind of a, we were out in front of a lot of other states in doing that, so.
Great. Thank you so much for that really helpful history. And I think I speak for everybody when I say we really appreciate all of the tremendous work that you and others like Professor Roski have done over the years. So our first question comes from our very own Professor Jency Anderson. Professor Anderson says, there's a lot of discussion these days of what white allies can do to understand and assist in the Black Lives Matter movement. Can you discuss how the allies can best support and understand the LGBTQ plus community?
Well, I believe that Equality Utah, which began in the early 2000s, to a great extent through the work of Jane Marquardt and several other of our then colleagues, have paved the way, have opened the doors for allies to join the movement. That is to say, so the annual dinner for many years was called the Allies Dinner. And the numbers grew in the early years from just several dozen people to ultimately several thousand people. And it seems to me that allies have, in fact, figured out ways of coming out and assisting those in the LGBT movement through joining pride parades, through helping to speak when there are public forums in town meetings. And I think that one of the most important things that allies can do and LGBT people can do is to constantly engage in dialogue. Dialogue with neighbors, but dialogue with the community, to express the importance of recognition and inclusion and justice, to talk about their own lives. Some allies have LGBTQ members of their families, and I think sharing that is very important. In a strange way, or in a very real way, not strange way, sharing narratives about gay people, about LGBTQ people, normalizes who we are. We become just part of the complex, rich tapestry of daily life. So that, for me, is one of the most important things that allies can do.
Jency, that's a great question. I think we're all trying to learn those skills right now with the Black Lives Matter. I mean, we all have books on our list here that we need to read and people that we need to talk to. And we thought we understood, and now we go, no, we didn't really understand the hurdles that people are facing. Just a quick story I'll share of the value of allies. In the mid-90s, there was a litigation magazine in Utah put out by the bar called Voir Dire. And they ran a one-page article on me as an up-and-coming attorney in Ogden who was a good litigator, blah, blah. And it was just like one mention of, and she and her partner have children and enjoy hiking and skiing or something. That was it on the, but somebody wrote a complaint saying, well, yeah, you pretty much acknowledged that she was a lesbian by saying she and her partner. And why would you publicly honor a lesbian? That's just disgusting. And so the editors of Voir Dire called me and said, you know, we have this letter to the editor that's really critical of you, but we feel like we have to run it. And I said, well, you know, it's true. I am a lesbian. It's unfortunate, but go ahead and run it. But the response I got from allies was amazing. I mean, like a lot of judges and U.S. attorney and attorney general people and people in big Salt Lake law firms who didn't all even know me, but came to my defense and wrote a one-page response saying that was unfair to criticize Jane for being an open lesbian, and Jane is a good lawyer, and it has nothing to do with who she loves. And what that did for me, I mean, I was like not happy to see this critical letter, but then here was this huge response that wasn't in just Voir Dire, that nobody really read that much. It was in the Utah State Bar Journal, and then it got picked up on national news. So if I ever wondered if I needed to be out, I was now really out. But it not only gave me confidence it was okay to be a lesbian. I had a lot of lesbian attorney friends who were not out, who were watching me, and they're going, wow, well, you know, maybe we can be out too. Look, she survived that. So just the power of allies understanding and coming to your defense, that was huge for me. And I think that we're now learning that, trying to learn what we can in the Black Lives Matter movement.
Great, thank you so much. So our next question comes from Will Morrison. Will asks, one hot topic in schools right now is how to handle transgender athletes. Should such athletes be required to compete against others in their same gender at birth? How should schools deal with this?
So I, as Will suggests, this is a really difficult topic. What athletics is about is having peers compete with one another. I am not fully immersed in this issue, but my understanding is that one approach that sort of proves helpful is that to the extent that a person, and this may not apply to high school, but to the extent that a professional athlete at least has undergone some kind of medical intervention in the form of hormones or something, and has changed their body accordingly, that what we're interested in is fair competition. And if two people have comparable strength levels, there is no reason that one need to look beyond that to what they happen to have between their legs or have been born with, that as long as we can keep up the fairness of competition, that should be enough. Maybe more difficult in high school because it could well be that some people who self-identify as of the opposite sex may not yet have started any medical intervention. So this remains a difficult problem, and just to throw it in, it becomes a really interesting problem once one understands that there are some people who simply do not identify as male or female, but as non-binary. How do we work non-binary people into this world of athletic competition? So Will's question raises as many questions as my meager response is able to answer.
Yeah.
All right, our next question comes from our own Professor Robin Craig. Professor Craig asked, one of the interesting parts of the book in the Thailand section was the culture-specific construction of gender identity, i.e. that some cultures are not strictly binary. Do any of the panelists have experience with these other cultural constructions and how the law is different in other countries? I can actually start a little bit on this one. Speaking for my own culture, for indigenous cultures here in the United States, many tribes recognize non-binary people, and we commonly refer to them as two spirits. The concept is that there are multiple spirits, both the male and the female, that are in the body, and so they have this unique position within many tribes. And so in many tribes historically, including my own, those individuals who were two spirits were given positions of authority and were really looked up to in the community because they had these multiple spirits within their bodies. And so they were really looked to as being special and unique and people to be appreciated, excuse me, within the community. And but then we started to have some missionaries who came into the communities. And so some indigenous communities in the United States moved away from that trend of respecting and having two-spirit people really revered within the community, and some people kept it. So we saw a bit of a schism, but that's certainly something that we have in Indian country, and that's been an issue for us that we've worked through. I don't know if either of our panelists have any experience with that.
Really? Good question.
I have no direct experience. I am aware that in addition to indigenous communities, there are other cultures like the Indian culture that recognizes what is in effect a third gender, the hijras in Indian culture. And this is not uncommon, that the binary is not as binding elsewhere in the world, or even in our country in Native American cultures, as it is in mainstream American and Western European cultures.
So unfortunately, we're running a little short on time, so this will be our last question, and it comes from Victoria Vincent. Victoria, it's good to see you again. Victoria is a up-and-coming law student who's interested in law school, and she's joined us on several of our book reviews now. And Victoria asks, in the United States, we have had very strict gender stereotypes in the past. Do you think that individuals have more commonly turned to transgender because they find a sense of relief for being different through being transgendered? Coming from living in Finland, the language does not include pronouns for he and she, and individuals are accepted in any package that they come in, any personality traits that they might have. Would this be a healthier approach to take in the United States in regards to acceptance?
And
the answer, Victoria, is yes.
Yeah, interesting perspective. I didn't know Finland did not have pronouns, but yeah, interesting. Most of my foreign country experience is working in the Middle East, where gender is very defined, you know. So from the Middle East to Finland, there's a wide range of cultures and things to learn here.
Yeah. So, as people may or may not be aware, among my major projects is involvement in a project that seeks to pave the way for all gender multi-user restrooms around the country. And among many other reasons that I believe that all gender restrooms would answer a lot of problems is in the same way that creating marriage equality completely got rid of the issue of whether you're a man or a woman. Creating all gender restrooms completely gets rid of the tension that arises as to whether someone is rightfully in one bathroom or in another. But more directly to Victoria's point, many other countries have already moved in this direction. And we, in terms of Western cultures, are dragging our feet toward recognizing the diversity and richness of gender identity among our people.
And that's a great note to end on about how we can be inclusive and include everybody in our communities. And I really encourage you, Professor Kogan has a project, Stalled, his book project that he's worked on. And so if you haven't had a chance to read it, it's just fantastic. And so please do. So unfortunately, we are out of time. I just want to thank our amazing panelists, Jane Marquardt and Terry Corrigan, Kogan, excuse me. Oh my goodness. It's early in the morning still. But thank them both for joining us on this panel today. I know I have certainly learned a lot. It's been just a fantastic panel and a really wonderful way to celebrate Pride Month and the contributions of members of our LGBTQ community to SJQ community and also our larger community. I do want to let everybody know that we have a bit of a special event coming up next week. So on June 29th, we're hosting actually another webinar associated with books to discuss race and racism. And Dean Martell Teasley, who's the Dean of the Social Work School, will be joining me for that conversation. And we're going to be framing our conversation around 2 books. So the first book is by James Baldwin, and it's called The Fire Next Time, which is actually appropriate because James Baldwin really contributed greatly both to the Black community and to the LGBT community. So it's great that we're able to talk about him. And then also The Fire This Time, which is a newer book by Jasmine Ward. And we're going to have a dialogue about race and the issues that have come out recently around the anti-racist protests and the recent killings. So please do feel free if you're interested to join us. That's going to be the 29th, and it's going to be at noon, and so we can get you that information. And then next month, July, for our book club, our next book is going to be The Black and the Blue, which is specifically a book about policing and potential police violence and racial interactions, again, building off this work that has initially been done recently around the anti-racist protests and killings. And so that will be our book for July to continue that conversation. So again, I thank our fabulous panelists and thank you for starting your day with us. And we hope you all have a wonderful day and a wonderful Pride Month. Thanks so much.
Thank you.